I have a great brand new MacBook Pro that I've had a week and a half that just locked up tight on me. So let's reboot. It's more fun this way. This way, you know, I'm not cheating. Everything is live. You hope. You'll find out in a minute. Well, there's something I wanted to do anyway. It's kind of a trick. It has nothing to do with Ruby and Rails. I'm on the No Fluff Just Stuff speaking tour. There's a guy on the tour named Venkat. Has anyone ever heard Venkat speak? I know some of you guys have. Cool. What does he do when you answer a question? Who answered that? Cool. And he does it like this. Oops, missed. Sorry. Then he throws again, and he goes, oops, I missed again. But these don't travel good on the airplane, so I brought them here. And the best way to make sure that everyone in the audience is awake after lunch is to throw things at them. But because it's candy, nobody gets mad. And because I'm waiting for the Mac to reboot, I'm going to throw a lot of candy. See, you look for people who aren't watching, and you target them. No, we're not there yet. So who else wants candy? Nerds, anyone? Oh, man. Heads up. Woo! Anyone closer? One of the things I was telling Nathaniel about my new Mac is it is a little wonky, and sometimes when you shut down, it takes several minutes to reboot. So if it takes too long, I'm going to recruit somebody with a Subversion client and PowerPoint. Actually, that might not work too well because I have third-party gems I need. This might need that. Let's see. One of the things I love about this talk. Oh, candy. Yeah. More candy. Please, please. Oh, sorry. He was taking a picture and I hit his hand. Well, usually at the No Fluffs we have desks. And it's something, I don't mean to do it, but someone will be taking notes. And even though I'm looking this way and I throw it that way, I always hit them right at the top of the head. It's nice and clump. It's we sing, we dance. One of the things I do like about this talk, right? We're Ruby pro. Is anyone here not a Ruby developer? You work with Ruby people, though. You've still had the sauce, right? We learned Ruby. This thing is probably running FSDK in the background. We learned Ruby. We learned Rails. I mean, we just heard Ken talking about how we move up the software lifecycle. I mean, some of us have done C. We've done Smalltalk. Smalltalk's not really the evolution. We've done Java, and you've moved up to this beautiful language, Ruby, right? We get garbage collection, we get dynamic typing, we get all this cool stuff. So what do? You come to a talk where I tell you how to go all the way back to C. Who's coded C for money? Anyone? Hi. And anyone? I had not, when I started working with the Relevance guys about a year ago for a consulting gig, I've always done back-end stuff. I hadn't done C in 10 years. And I was going to get to work with Justin Getlin and Stu Holloway, the Ajax guys. And Wade knows what they had me do. I was helping him with it last week. They said, great, you want to learn GUI, you want to learn the front end of Rails, come write a database adapter to the Ingress database. Has anyone ever used Ingress? It predates SQL, so there's some interestingness in the C API. So go to Ingress, go to C, integrate it with Ruby, then go to Rails. And I just bought a shiny new Mac, which I wish I had with me right now because it works a little better than this one. And Ingress doesn't run on Macs. So then I had to run Linux anyway. So it was, no, we're still pizza wheeled here. Dang it. And speaking of crossing the chasm, I started working at Cisco. Hey, a week and a half ago, and that's why I have a new box here. And it's gone. Let's bring it back to this screen at least. Please return to me. Hello. There we go. On the plus side, it's got 4 gigs of RAM. Once it does boot, it runs really fast. Just have to get there first. All right. We're back again. I'm glad I brought that candy. That was an almost didn't bring kind of thing. I unplugged it for a second. Sorry. No, let's see. He's thinking. Cool. Now let me unmirror the display. Yeah, we're coming up. We're good now. But I'm mirrored and everything's all fat. Oh, it's not there? Okay. Let me.
Projector must be powered down.
No. It's not. You want me to leave it plugged in or unplug? I've unplugged here. Wants me to do something up there. Plug back in?
No, plug back in. It's fine. It's just a protector.
Okay.
You're good. There we go.
Woohoo! All right. It's more fun this way, right?
Every conference has to have one.
Oh, yeah. Now, if I can turn off my mirroring. How do I turn off the mirroring if it's not showing in the task? I was on displays.
Arrangement. The other one was behind. Arrangement. Another one behind. Arrangement.
Uh-huh.
Oh, no, you were on the right one. Yeah, this one. Arrangement.
Yeah, that's, oh, duh, there's the click. Okay, now we're back where I want to be. Cool.
Yeah, that's fine.
Close enough. Grab that. Come on. Now I can close things now. All right. I'm here till Friday. Try the veal. Let me start some things up. Okay. Where are we at? Almost, I promise. Okay. Seamless transition between speakers. Any questions on the first part of the presentation? Cool. Why bother? I mean, this feeds into the whole, you've come maybe from Java, you've come from PHP, you've come from other languages, and Ruby's supposed to be very elegant. And it is. It's very expressive in terms of lines of code. I really like Ruby. We really like some of the tools on top of it. Why bother going back to learn C? This seems kind of a step backwards, right? Existing libraries. In my filler, I was talking about the Ingress database. We had a client that needed Ingress. They had Ingress. There was an investment there, but they liked Rails. They wanted to work with Justin and Stu. They love Rails. So we had to tie back into something existing that only had a C interface. Makes it possible. Legacy hardware. Everyone said they'd read the Pickaxe book. There's a whole chapter on extending Ruby with C. So if you like this talk, go read their book. There's a lot more stuff in there. It goes a lot deeper. Their examples tie into a jukebox. The example they give ties you back into some hardware bits. What we're going to look at today is rewriting the hotspots. If you write a Rails app, it's fast enough most of the time. But maybe you want to do something that's really numerically intensive, and you're stuck on our VM. Now, I like our VM, but someone this week looked at me. A Ruby developer, Rails developer, makes his living doing this. He said, I love the language. We have a crappy VM. He said, but it's good enough, but it'll get better. And it's a whole lot better, easier to write a good VM than it is to write a good language. I'm not saying I agree with him 100%, but I like the comment. So these are some reasons we might want to go back and tinker with C. Today's talk is going to have 4 parts. We're going to look at the Ruby C extensions. These are really easy. If you've ever done J&I and tried to get Java to go to C, you know it's hard. This is going to blow you away. It's trivial. We're going to look at inline Ruby. If you just have little bits you want to convert, you can put C code right into your Ruby files. You do not have to go out and do external bits. This one I heard about. I gave this talk at OSCON, and the guy who's doing the Ruby Cocoa bindings came up to me and told me about Ruby to C, where there's some conversion code where you can point your Ruby code into this project, and it spits out ANSI C. So if you don't want to write C, you don't have to, which is also good. And finally, we're going to do some Rails and C. So the tools we need, and some of this is a little basic on the introduction because I gave it at OSCON. They were heavy on the Perl guys. So wanted to make sure everyone had everything installed. You've got to have Ruby. You've got to have Rails. Got to have GCC. Not everybody does. MKMF. I'll show you how to get that one installed. Ruby Inline is just a gem. So for the Ruby C extensions, it is pretty easy to do. There are a few conventions you need to follow, but you can share variables back and forth. If you want to get the Ruby code running over here and stick things in an array and then access it down from C and back and forth instead of passing things around, you can do that. You can pass bits back and forth. But to get started, we need three things, right? We need C code, which we all have in our head. So I'll pick a volunteer. No, I'm kidding. I've got C code prepared. We need some C code. We're going to need a makefile. Does anyone like makefiles? They're ugly. I'm not going to write a makefile either. I'm very lazy when it comes to these things. Ruby's going to write the makefile for us. And finally, we need Ruby code. And I know makefile is one word, but my wife edits my slides for me, so sorry. I just realized she split that up. So let's look at some C code. This is all we need, but let's walk through it, because there's a little bit there. First, you got to do the includes, right? This is where you get all your Ruby goodness, all your Ruby libraries come from right there. Next, value sample C. Value, in this case, is the equivalent of a Ruby object. Anything we pass around from Ruby to C, it's going to be generic, it's going to be a value. In this case, sample C is just the name I picked. It is our handle that's going to, what we're going to hang things off of and then give this to Ruby. So this is our main object, the sample C. Nothing magic about that. Here we have a routine called execme. Notice the return type? Value. Now the other thing, I've set my nerds down. When I ask questions, if the audience doesn't answer, I find it's a lot of fun to just pick up things and throw them at people. And eventually, I just have to go over and rattle the bag or the wrappers, and everybody kicks in. So what was the return type on execme? Value. Man, I love this crowd. Good crowd. Hometown crowd. Anything you return is going to be value. You're going to have to take care of it another way to get it to the type you want. The other thing you'll notice is value self is the arg coming in. Any code on the C side that you're going to talk to from Ruby has to have at least one argument, value self. Later, when we look down here and we have to tell the Ruby code how many arguments there are, we list it as 0. We don't even count that. Value self, it's taken for granted. It's just there. So anything you write, don't leave that out. Printf, this is just generic C code, right? I'm not doing anything crazy here. I'm just saying execme is written in C, run from Ruby, that's it. Plain vanilla. And then return qnil. Qnil is void in this context. All we're doing, instead of not returning anything, is we're returning qnil. If you think you're being clever and you eliminate that, or you return void and it runs, good for you. 3 or 4 times later, it'll throw a stack trace. You've got to have the qnil. Trust me on this. When I was first learning it, I didn't put it in there, and it ran. So I said, cool, I don't need that. And then later, things throw up everywhere. So you need the qnil. You cannot return void. You've got to have something there. And this is a init sample C. This is the equivalent. Well, this is our mapping file. This is our mapping bits. We have to tell C and Ruby what's connected to that sample C object we hand back and forth. So sample C is equal to RB, Ruby, define a class. Pretty straightforward naming convention. We're going to call it sample C. You can name it anything you want, but what's in these quotes is what Ruby sees. So remember this one. And then it's going to be a RB C object, Ruby C object. Once you get your head into the naming conventions, they're very intuitive. It's very straightforward stuff. The next thing, now we've got an object, is we want to hang a method off of it. So we're going to do a Ruby define method off of sample C. Ruby's going to call it execme. It's going to map to the C class execme. These don't have to match at all. I just happen to match them up because, again, I'm lazy, and if I have a typo somewhere, this way I can paste more often. But you need to tell it how many arguments you have. And in this case, even though there is value self, you listed it 0. Any questions on that before we run on past it? Yes?
Why are those two things static?
Good question. Oh, sorry. Might have made it if I'd had more arc. All the examples I've worked with are based on static, and I knew somebody would ask that question, and I should have dug in. I don't know, but I've never seen any code samples that weren't static, and I've never really dug in and tried to play with it otherwise. So, anyone know?
That name won't let you get library that you link to, there's no reason to export that symbol from that translation you did. Oh. It just keeps it private to this file.
Keeps it private to this particular. Okay. We have a few people locally in the Ruby group that have done a lot more of this type of work than I have. So if there's questions, throw them out. More fun that way. Especially if you're in the front and I can hit you with nerds. Anybody else? Okay. When we make the makefile, right? I don't want to write makefiles. If you write them, I might can edit them, but the odds are low. I could edit your Perl before I could edit your makefile, and that's a low bar. So I'm going to cheat. We're going to make a file called xcomp, external configuration.rb, and we're going to put 2 lines in it. 1, require mkmf. 2, create a makefile. This is hard stuff, but I think you're the advanced crowd. Are you with me? Yeah. That's it. You want to make a makefile? You type Ruby xcomp. That's it. Spits out about 5 pages of makefile. We'll look at it in a minute. I love that. I don't have to do anything. Of course, when it doesn't work right, it's a little more interesting. Let's see. So the practical tip I'll throw out here, when you run this, a lot of people, we got Linux users here. Yeah, if you're doing Ruby to C and you're on Windows, don't do that. Go get VirtualBox or VMware or Parallels and run a Linux. Things work a lot better there. If you see Ruby no such file to load, mkmf load error, which doesn't really mean a lot to you, then you installed Ruby. You did not install Ruby dev. First time I saw that, I went out and hit Google, I hit Yahoo, and I started searching on mkmf. There are C versions, there are Perl versions, there's all kinds of mkmf tools. I'm installing tons of mess. And finally I stumbled across that. Everybody who sees that error goes out and starts Googling and running down mkmf tools. Just install whatever version of Ruby you're on. There's your apt-get command, if you use ports, whatever. The dev version of Ruby, not the runtime. So what's our Ruby code look like? Well, you got to require sample C, create one, create a handle to it, sample C.new, and run it. Now, who's done J&I before? Anyone? Is this easier? Yeah. That's all we got to do. That's it. We have just gone tip to tip on everything you have to do to write C code, map it over, and use it. That's pretty great. So let's do it. Oops. Without hitting the microphone. Let's go back to my terminal. Let's drag it up. Oh, we're mirrored again. We'll leave it. I know Firefox is bouncing. Let's get that. And let's bring up TextMate. Not that one. Let's look at Mate. Let's go desktop. I had all this stuff queued up. Ruby Hoedown. There's 2 things in here. See in the PowerPoint and my code folder. Inside code we have C extensions. Let's bump this up a little bit here. A little more readable. So we're going to go first into C extensions. Bring up TextMate. And just like I told you, there's our xcomp. Exactly what's in the slides.
I bump it up a little more even.
Okay.
So the people in the back can read it.
They just didn't want to talk because they thought I'd hit them with nerds.
Great.
Okay. So there's our mkmf, our sample C file. You know what? Let's close off. No. Let's turn off the gutter. Hide the project drawer. There we go.
Jared?
Yes, sir.
Question. I'm not sure you said it, but is it naming by convention with the create makefile call as to which C file it's trying to generate against?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. When you give it that,
case in one, and the name's a little different, but it looks Ruby-ish. I think Rails-ish that way.
it's by convention. You want that sample C to match up to your C file.
All right.
Yep. Over in sample C, we have include Ruby H, static value. This looking familiar? I have one other thing in here called factorial that we'll look at later. We're using the Rails app, and there are mapping files. Any questions? Looks just like the PowerPoints, yeah? Okay. And then let's kick over to our prompt. We have no makefile in there, correct? No. Let's do Ruby xcomp RB. There's our makefile. You want to write this by hand? Ew. Hard, 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 hard. So yeah, this is a good thing. What's that? I don't like them. I get them made for me. Works great. So then I come in here and type make, and there is something odd on this machine. You wouldn't normally see this much to it. Usually, you just see that block, and that's all there is to it. But remember, one thing that everybody forgets to do, they run make, and then they run, what do we got in here? Ruby to C simple, and it works. It's written in C, run from Ruby. We could go edit the text, remake, and the text to be different. And then you go use it somewhere else, and it says it can't find it. The thing you have to remember, sudo make install. If you don't make install, it's only available from this local directory. And everybody does it, and everybody forgets it, and then they say, I'm trying to use it from Rails, I'm trying to use it from my application, it works great over here. Don't forget the install. So there we go. Questions about, you want to go edit the code, play with it, move on? Yes?
I noticed you were creating only one make file per class. Is that a limitation, or can you bundle more classes, more encapsulated classes in one make file?
Grab the pickaxe book, and if you don't want to pay for it, go to the Ruby Central site, Jed site, and look under /pickaxe, and the whole first edition is there for free, which is linked on the last page of the slides. There are dozens of options off of MKNF. So there are tons of different things you do for including different files, for checking for libraries. For this is a hello world type introduction.
Great, thank you.
But yeah, you can do tons and tons with it.
Where does it install by default?
It installs to the Ruby that you're running.
Some flip directory or something?
Why does it say Ruby?
If I'm not mistaken. It'll tell you exactly where it puts it. But what everybody does is they run it, they get their application running, it's all local in that folder, and then they go out to the real app and they try to use it, and it's not there. It's the make install. So skip past that. Now, usually there are advanced questions, so I put a lot more information in here. I'm not going to demo any of this stuff. I'm just going to show it to you, give you some pointers. What else can you do? Moving a Ruby object from Ruby to C with type checking, an int is cast. You take that value and pass it in as a num to int. Longs or num to longs. You get the feel for the, let me go back. The naming convention there is pretty straightforward. Numbers to long, numbers to int. Several people at OSCON came up and told me that I was doing my code wrong because I knew I was always passing in ints and longs, and I was using the first version, which had type checking, and this is much, 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 much faster. So just to make the differentiation, if you know you're passing in the right numbers and you're writing some core code, don't use type checking. It's fixed. You know it's good. Fixed to int or fixed to long. You notice the naming convention there, num2, fixed to? That's the only difference. If you want to go from C to Ruby and you're passing it up, you need an int to num or an int to fix. Anyone notice the naming convention there and want to tell me which one has type checking? Oh, come on, people. I'm going to have to throw nerds at you. Num does, fix doesn't. Very straightforward stuff. If you want to convert a car pointer to a string, RB string new 2, whichever. There are lots of variations on this stuff. If you're going to do anything real with it, get the pickaxe book. But this will get you started.
It's also in the header file too.
Yes, it is. Yes, it
Actually,
is.
subtle difference on that first one.
Please.
Could return a big num. If the int you're passing is out of the range of fixed num.
Yeah. He was saying on the first entry here, just for the microphone, if the int is too big, it'll return a big num. Big num. When I gave this at OSCON, one of the guys who sat in the audience, I had met at the conference, and he was doing the Ruby Cocoa bindings for Apples, probably one of the premier experts in the world on the technology. I'm like, there's nothing here for you, man. This is hello world.
I think that's also a danger of using the second one because it doesn't check, so it won't do that, right?
Right, so what if you pass a big num from Ruby down to C?
If you pass something that way out of bounds, it does bad things.
That's what I figured.
It's an overflow type thing. You get weird numbers. You might get a stack. You might get a core dump. You might not. But you're not going to get what you passed in. or anything close to it. If you want to share variables, I love this. In C, you can make a Ruby array. RB array new. You can stick something in there. Does anybody, we're going to do an, I don't know what IV stands for. Does anyone know what IV stands for? Instance variable. Thank you. Instance variable step. You see that self handle? Remember the value self we've been passing around? You got to have that. In Ruby, it's going to be at column names, and the local variable in C is going to be column names. Now we have experts in the room. What's wrong with that line?
Camel casing.
For push, we don't need cell. I didn't really give you enough context to tell. Put it in context of that one. This one's right, that one's wrong. You can't push a C object into a Ruby array. It'll take it, you'll go to Ruby and try to pull it back out again and say, I'm getting garbage, this stuff doesn't work. This is a conversion. This is a Ruby string new, and the 2 makes a copy. So I've got to take that next column name, which is a C car pointer, and convert it. If you don't convert it and you put all this stuff in your code, you'll think it works, it looks like it works, and then Ruby gets garbage. Just something to look for. If you want to run, now we're talking about how to run Ruby from C later. What if you want to run, C from Ruby. What if you want to run it the other way? These examples are straight out of the Pickaxe book, so if you know it, you're going to think I copied them. I did. So given credit for what I rip off here. You can do a Ruby eval string and take something like a list and do an each on it. You can also do a Ruby function call. You get a nice tight level of integration. Questions before I move on to the next technology? Yes?
If you have something that you alloced in C land and then you bring it up to into Ruby land and you're playing around with it and something in C land, do you allocate that, or you basically?
No, the question is if I allocate memory in C and then I pass it around in Ruby, what happens? You have to free it. You can create memory leaks this way. Trust me. I know this to be true from personal experience. Yeah, we're not going into that with this, but you have to alloc and free it up again. The garbage collection, you can notify the garbage collection and say, this is something for you to handle, but you have to go in and do the notification yourself. It is not automatically picked up. If you're going to go to C, you got to work a little bit. Sorry.
You're doing RB string too. That's allocating memory in the Ruby VM, so that way you can do away with that string if that's allocating memory in C.
When you use the RB string new 2, the question is, does garbage collection handle that?
No, I'm wondering if you're passing a malloc string in as a parameter from C.
The string 2 copy, the new 2 copies.
Okay.
The new doesn't. So everybody uses new 2.
Got it. Yeah.
I mean, if you go look in the Pickaxe book, they don't even list new. It goes straight to new 2 because it'll hose you. On the other hand, it's also been 1.5 years since I coded this. So if I say something dumb, yell at me. But I'm almost positive that's the case. So the new 2 is the one you want that makes the copy. This one's kind of cool. This is Inline C. You're writing your Ruby code. You don't want to go through the xcomp. Maybe it's a production environment. You don't have Wade. And so you can't get to run a makefile on the server to do a make install. So you're going to cheat. You're going to shove the C right down into your Ruby code. And the sysadmin will be none the wiser, maybe. It's easy to install. It's just a Ruby gem. And you install it like that. Gem install Ruby Inline. That's why I didn't grab somebody else's laptop when this thing was pizza wheeling on me up here. There's a few third-party libraries I need. So the Ruby Inline code is that. So let's dig through it a little bit. One, if you're not running this from Rails, you have to require Ruby gems. Nobody ever puts this in their code samples, and it drives me nuts, because I'm the one who's always sitting here saying, why can't it find inline? Require Ruby gems. Require inline. If you don't have it installed right, obviously that won't be there. It's a class. I called it Ruby to C. Nothing particularly crazy, but here's where our magic starts. Inline do builder, and then we have a block. Everything in between here is where the C goes. So we're going to call it builder.c. Who knows what the %q is? The quote. That's right. Anybody spot why I'm using it? Instead of a normal quote?
Double quotes.
Yeah. The preferred way to do this is this. Builder C with quotes to quote. But it didn't really work well with the whole printf thing. Yeah, it wanted double quotes too. So we went with the doubles instead. I went with %Q, which is nothing but a way to quote it. And within that quote, straight C code. You can put anything you want in here. This is exactly what it looked like from before. And then when we're done, handle equals Ruby to C new, exec me. The first time you run this, it'll compile the code and put it into a folder in your home directory called .rubyinline. And after that, it just runs it. So if you want to sneak this into a production application, don't tell Wade you did it. Just stick it in there. As long as the process running has rights to its own home directory and it can find GCC, it'll compile and go. But there's no reason for you to believe me if you can't see it run, right? Let's see here. Bring that back up. Let's move out of the C extensions folder and go into the Ruby Inline folder. Bring that up yet again. We have 2 files in here. Let's hide the drawer yet again. Pretty straightforward. Look accurate. Similar to the slides, except it says really live. But because we want to really know it's live, let's go really, really live. And run Ruby to C. You notice it takes a second to run here, and then it's done. What happens if I run it the next time? Faster. It runs really fast after it's had a chance to compile. That's it. If you need small chunks of C, there's no reason to go all the way out and set up the make file and the xcomp. I mean, it's a little more complicated to go external. But again, if you've integrated C with Java and some other languages, this is not that bad. But this is even easier. So it's kind of cool.
You make your font bigger.
I can make my font bigger.
Also, if you're bold, it allows you to generate the C code.
Well, if you want to generate this, if you wanted to go dig into it, you could. But if you wanted to generate your C code, there's another technology you should use. So who codes C? Is anyone who's coded C for money now? Oh, we got a few. Cool. Did you write any C code this week? Oh, dang. Okay. If you have C questions, grab that guy in the blue shirt. Yeah. I like what DHH says. Write less code, right? I don't want to write code. I'm lazy. We're all lazy. So don't write it. Generate it. Of course, the technology I'm about to show you doesn't really quite work, but it comes highly recommended. And it's an active project. It is an active project that will soon work. The other thing, again, with this new machine, I can't do too much to it because I'll host a production staged environment. But anyway, this is pretty straightforward. Gem install Ruby to C, not table of contents. Laurent Sansonetti highly recommends this. He's the guy doing the Apple Ruby Cocoa, or the Apple Ruby bindings. Sorry, the Cocoa Ruby, what's that? Ruby OSA. There you go. He uses it and loves it. What I've heard is if you get it installed and it fits in well with your environment, you're golden. If you have trouble getting it working, I'll give you some advice from the authors at the end that I think you'll find very relevant. So some sample code here. Oh, man. Okay, I didn't get my animations fixed here. You're going to have a straight class. This is just a factorial class in Ruby. That's it. Def main, return factorial, end. This is another ripped off example. I'll give you the URL in a minute. So this is nothing but factorial written in Ruby. So to use it, you run the translate to Ruby tool. You feed it in the code you want to convert, and you pipe it out to a C file. And you'll get something that looks like this. Long factorial, long F. I reformatted it a little bit. It was a little long on the page. But I mean, it's just pretty straightforward C code, right? Nothing exotic here. There's a lot of Ruby this thing can't handle and will never handle, like an eval. But if you need some basic algorithms and you want to code them in Ruby and see if it can handle spit and not to C, this is a good place to start. The author's warning, I tried to get it running. I'm looking for tutorials. Nobody's writing up any help files on it. And I noticed in the README, That pretty much sums it up for me. It's a very early project. And again, that's from their readme.txt. It is a very early project. It's for Meta, the Meta Ruby project. They're trying to write Ruby in Ruby. Then use this, which is Ruby, to convert it out to C for a given platform. So that once Ruby's written in Ruby, it doesn't matter if someone's ported it to that platform or not. You can use this to port it to that platform. It's kind of a bootstrapping effort, but they are actively working on it. ZenSpider and Ryan Davis, some guys who have a pretty good reputation in the community. I have very little doubt that this is a good project that will be rock solid. It's just not there yet.
ZenSpider and Ryan Davis are the same person.
Oh, well, that explains why they keep posting in the same threads all the time and never disagree. Okay. I are educated. If you didn't have an open motherboard over there, I'd throw nerds at you. I would.
You are an agile presenter.
This is true. You gotta be agile. Yes, sir.
Actually, ZenSpider and Ryan Davis are the same person, but there's another person that always also agrees with ZenSpider and works on this. It's Eric Hoedown.
Cool. So maybe he has a third personality split out there somewhere.
Yeah,
have you actually met them all?
Yeah, he has a physical manifestation as well.
Okay, that's the trick. If you can pull the physical manifestation off. Well, if you want more information, including that exact sample, there's where the RubyForge project is, but that's nothing but the Ruby docs. There's no README, there's no help files, there's nothing else. Here's an example from ZenSpider, and here's a post from Ryan Davis that actually walk you through. I'm going to get teased about this for months. Hit the links if you want to learn more. Let's so that's the Ruby. What about Rails, right? There's a few twists when you try to run this stuff inside of Rails. Let's find the hotspots and convert it over. So again, this is a little probably below this crowd's level, but this was for the OSCON crowd. When you look at a Rails log, you get this, which is a lot of information, but what I want you to focus on is this part, which again is too small to read, so we bring it out up here. This controller completed in 0.02 seconds and can run 36 requests a second. For quick and dirty, really, really, really crude Rails benchmarking, find the slow controllers. Just go in there and find out what's slow, and then do something like this. Start equals time now, run your code, done, elapsed equals, and then log it. This is not using a profiler, this is not using a debugger. This is really, really, again, really basic. But this will get you into the hotspots pretty quickly. Once you get there, watch the log, find the controller, zero in, convert. If you want to do more than this, go here. I love the name of this, How to Profile Your Rails Application and Make Rails Go Vroom. That is a really good post with some links to some additional real profiling tools. So this is not about how to do the profiling. But for a quick demo, I'm going to show you how fast Factorial, just for a simple example, runs in Ruby. Then we're going to look at Ruby within Rails with Inline C, and finally Ruby with the C extension. So let's kick out of there. Remove all the windows yet again. Let's see, we're in the code folder. Let's go into the Rails. And let's start up a mongrel. There we go, and let's tail off the devlog. Stick this so that we can see as much as possible. Let's switch over to Firefox and bring it up. This is a really simple application, nothing crazy. Just to give you a benchmark, current time. And when I kick over to the terminal, we can do current time 35 times a second. Does anyone here have an application that has more than 35 users a second? Yeah, I didn't think so. Rails is pretty fast. Again, this is a naive, simple thing. Let's go back to the main page, and to serve up that little static page, I can do 428 a second. Does anyone need that? Okay, just checking. So let's run Ruby. Let's run Factorial. I'll tell you what, before I run the Factorial, let me show you. You know what? I'm actually running late on time. I will quickly show you the controller. And what's that? Oh, font again. time.now, nothing crazy there. Common, we're going to run factorial 12 simply because anything above factorial 12 overflows to C code. It's just not as good as Ruby. We're going to run it 50,000 times when we do. So factorial in Ruby is going to call a routine called fact, which is down here at the bottom. Factorial, if n is less than 2, return 1, else n equals, we're going to call it recursively. So when we run that, let's run tail again. When we run Ruby, factorial in Ruby, took a second to run. Wow, 2 requests a second. That's kind of slow. And it will pretty consistently do that. If I come in here and I run it again, and we go back to the log, yet again, we get 2 requests a second. Really almost 3, but it's 0.3 seconds. So that's something to keep an eye on. So if we decide to tune it, let's go back to TextNate and look at factorial C extension. Remember the sample code? Sample C new, and then inside my at my loop times, handle factorial extension. All I'm doing is running the same C code we just looked at. So if I come in here and run, oops, that was in Ruby. Let's come back to Inline C. Watch our log again. We got 0.1, which is 9 requests a second. And you're right, I ran C inline, which really hoses up my C inline. These things are out of order. I'm sorry. Well, dang it. I'm going to run C inline again just to make a point. Remember I was telling you C inline compiles the first time? That was 9 requests a second. It took 1/10 of a second to run. Relatively speaking, much faster than the Ruby, but if I run inline again, how's that? 50 requests a second. Once it gets compiled, it will consistently run at about 50 requests a second. 51 that time. So again, your first time in, you got to compile it, you got to spit it out, but after that it runs great. The thing to watch when you do this in Ruby, what happens every time you hit a controller in development? It reloads it. It reparses it. It redoes things like Ruby inline. And it tries to overwrite your existing compiled code, and it doesn't work. So you put this stuff in place, you stick your C code inline in your Ruby controller, you run it once, it works, you go score. You run it again, if you do that level of testing, and the second time it fails, and you go, wait a minute. So you try this, you try that, you bounce your mongrel, you hit it again, it works. You hit it a second time, it fails. It's because it's reloading every time. The easiest way to fix that is to put that code in your lib folder. Your lib stuff isn't reloaded every time. It's reloaded once. Just a little FYI. I'll cover that later in the slides. So we're hitting 50 times a second with inline. What will a Ruby C extension do? Any bets? In between? Okay. In between? Halfway?
I would say in between where you were when you ran the Inline C the second time and just pure movement.
So he thinks it's going to be halfway between the 50, 51 requests a second, 2 requests a second. So you're thinking 25 or 30?
Yeah.
Dang, actually got the right person. Cool. Anyone else?
Faster.
Faster. Okay. Why would it be faster?
Guts.
They're about C.
No, I said it would be the same.
Oh, okay. We have one person saying the same. 32 the first time. Dang, it's supposed to be the same. 47, there we go. We had a little hiccup somewhere. Traditionally speaking, they run exactly the same. I mean, we're running 50 to 48, 48 to 51. Once you get the Ruby inline compiled, it doesn't run any faster or any slower than the Ruby extensions. So for you, it comes down to developer time. Or would you rather inline it? Does that work better for you in your environment? Or would you rather shell it out? Completely up to you. Generally speaking, most of the people I've talked to for big bits of C, like the Ingress driver I wrote, that was about 1,000 lines of C. I didn't inline that. We moved it out. For little short bits, when you're profiling stuff, go with inline. Actually, try them both and see what you like. So questions? Cool. I'm explaining it so well. Yes, sir.
So with the inline stuff, what can I access from that code?
You do not have the same level of integration. You can pass in variables, but you can't get back out again. So if you really want to be passing things back and forth and be reaching in variables on both sides, my understanding is you need to use the native C extensions. Remember what I said, a reload breaks Ruby inline. So you don't want to put it in your controller, put it in lib, or some people actually try to run in production mode, which means every time you touch the C code, you have to bounce your mongrel, which feels an awful lot like Java development in Tomcat, doesn't it? Don't do that. Put it in the lib folder and you're good to go. It will not reload from the lib folder until you bounce your mongrel, though. So you can't touch the code and get a reload. So my advice to you is before you move it into Rails, work with Ruby and get it working like you want it. Write your tests and get it returning the right values, then move it over to Rails. Don't try to develop your C code this way. Drive you nuts. Makes you feel like you're back in Java again. The Rails and C extensions, do the make install. If you go and you look at the news groups and you search on this, most of the hits you're going to get are people saying, it works in my Ruby folder, but it doesn't work for Rails, it doesn't work in my application. Make install. Everybody does it. The reason I'm making such a big point of this is when I wrote this, I did it. Everybody does it. Make install. Require the sample C. Now that you've looked at C extensions, don't stop with what you can write. When you start profiling your applications and you start tuning in what you want to make Rails, it's very fast with what you start with, but you want to take it up a notch. One of the first things I found when I was doing this sort of thing was Rexml versus Livexml. One's written in Ruby, one's written in C. If you use, any guesses on which one's faster? When you start parsing any appreciable amount of XML, Rexml might get your application running faster. It's pure Ruby. It runs everywhere. There's lots of reasons to start with it. It's not a bad library. But when you start tuning and you start moving towards the enterprise and you start crossing the chasm, you're going to want something a little bit quicker. And you'll find, here's a good example. You want a real-world benchmark of Ruby between C, 10 times faster. That is my experience. So there's lots of native C extensions out there. There are some disadvantages to C extensions. If you're in the JRuby world, you will never be able to use them. If you depend on Livexml or any C extension, and your team is trying to deploy inside of JRuby, which ThoughtWorks is doing, a lot of big companies are doing, you can't use the native C extensions. The technologies are incompatible. Charles Nutter says they will never work. Since he's one of the leads there, I would trust him. Performance implications, Ruby, C extensions, there's no overhead. When you go between Java and C with the J and I, you have some layers to go through. There's a little bit of a performance hit there. This stuff is just, it slides back and forth. I've never found anybody who is aware of any measurable performance impact from going back and forth. It's really, really fast. Inline C, first time and you're going to get a hit. If that matters for your application, write some code to run it when Mongrel starts. It's not that hard. Web resources, this is where I stole a lot of these examples from. Ruby Central, hit the pickaxe book. If you want more up-to-date information, buy the book, Dave and Andy. The version 2 is a lot better. There's a lot more information. Version 1 is still good stuff. The whole book is free. ZenSpider, a.k.a. Ryan Davis. I wrote a blog entry on this a year ago on doing some of the C extensions, some extra information in it. Livexml at RubyForge. I wrote a blog on this information this year, and how to profile your Rails application and make it go vroom. You got to include that one. That's just a cool title. Questions? And there's my ship it and stand slide. Your one mention of the book just wasn't enough. I had to play some more. Anybody have any questions? Cool. Yes.
I just have a comment just to show how easy it was. I just installed Ruby Inline, Hello World, everything works fine. C code right in the middle.
I love that. For the microphone, during the demonstration, he followed the slides, installed Ruby Inline, and he's run code already. That's good stuff. Here, you have 2 boxes, nerd. These are not running away. Caught them both. Excellent. Thank you, guys.